The tension in the air was palpable. The Washington, D.C. briefing room, usually filled with routine exchanges, felt different today. Karoline Leavitt, poised behind the podium, met the expectant gazes of reporters who were eager to carve their narratives from her words. The usual ritual of questioning began: tax policies, education reforms. Karoline navigated them with precision, offering polished responses that kept the press at arm's length while maintaining control of the conversation. Then, it happened. A voice, sharp and demanding, cut through the murmur of the room. "Ms. Leavitt, let's talk about the real issue here." Karoline already knew who it was before she even looked. The liberal reporter, a persistent critic, always pressing, always angling for controversy, sat near the front, her smirk barely hidden. The rhythmic tapping of her pen against her notepad was almost taunting. Karoline adjusted the microphone, maintaining an air of composure. "Go ahead." The reporter leaned forward, not missing a beat. "Do you think the administration's policies are intentionally designed to suppress certain communities?" "Because the data suggests." Karoline lifted a hand, cutting her off with practiced authority. "I've addressed this question before. Our administration is committed to policies that uplift all Americans, regardless of background. If you have a question pertaining to today's topic, I'd be happy to continue." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, a silent acknowledgement of the subtle pushback. But the reporter wasn't done. She leaned in further, voice laced with insistence. "You didn't actually answer the question, though. Can you directly address whether—" "I did answer," Karoline interrupted, her tone firm but composed. A glance at the other journalists signaled that she was ready to move on. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like things might settle, like the briefing could resume its usual rhythm. But then, "I just don't see why you're avoiding it," the reporter pressed. "It's a simple yes or no. Are these policies suppressing marginalized groups?" The room shifted. Reporters exchanged glances, some intrigued, others visibly uncomfortable. Press briefings weren't meant to be battlegrounds. But that was exactly what this was becoming. The weight of the moment settled on everyone's shoulders. Karoline exhaled slowly. "I'm not avoiding anything. I'm staying on topic. If you have a relevant question, I'll answer it. Otherwise, I'll be moving on." But the reporter wasn't backing down. She leaned even closer to the microphone, her voice cutting through the space. "So that's a no comment?" A hush fell over the room, not an absence of sound, but a silence thick with anticipation. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't passive but waiting, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Karoline squared her shoulders, placing both hands on the podium. "I've answered your question. Moving on." She pointed toward a journalist in the back. But before they could speak, "Why is it so hard for you to give a straight answer?" A flicker of irritation flashed across Karoline's face. Not much, just a brief tightening around her eyes, but enough for those paying close attention to catch it. She had dealt with difficult reporters before. There was a fine line between pressing for accountability and turning a briefing into a spectacle. And right now, it was clear which side this exchange had landed on. A few cameras panned between Karoline and the reporter, capturing every subtle movement, every nuance that could be spun into a headline. Karoline inhaled through her nose. "I don't believe in wasting anyone's time. If you have a new question, I'll answer it. Otherwise, I'd like to give others a chance." The reporter smirked. "Sure, new question. Why is this administration so afraid of transparency?" A sharp intake of breath from some of the journalists. Others scribbled furiously, sensing the shift. This wasn't just a routine briefing anymore, it was a moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and debated. Karoline gave a slow, measured blink, the only visible sign that the remark had landed. Her grip on the podium tightened for a second before she let go, exhaling slightly. Then she smiled, not the warm, diplomatic kind, but a different kind of smile. One that said, "I see exactly what you're trying to do." She took her time before responding. "Transparency is exactly what this administration stands for. But what you're doing isn't about transparency, it's about theatrics." The words hung in the air, charged with meaning. The reporter's smirk faltered, if only for a moment. Another journalist, seated toward the back, cleared his throat, attempting to steer the conversation back to policy. But the same voice interrupted again. "So you're dismissing valid concerns as theatrics? The American people deserve real answers." The cameras caught everything, the slight tilt of Karoline's head, the way the other reporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats, A veteran journalist, one who had covered politics for decades, leaned back and muttered to a colleague, "This isn't journalism, this is performance art." The reporter, however, didn't care. She knew exactly what she was doing. The longer she kept this going, the more viral it would go. Confrontations like this were social media gold. Karoline saw it too. She had a choice: engage and give the moment more fuel, or shut it down entirely. She sighed, her gaze flicking toward the security personnel at the edge of the room. She didn't have to say anything. The shift in her eyes was enough. The room tensed. Everyone knew what that meant. This was no longer a debate, it was about to escalate. The air in the room felt heavier. Some journalists avoided eye contact. Others gripped their pens a little tighter. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. The reporter, unwavering, remained leaned forward, pen resting against her notepad. A quiet smirk at the corner of her mouth. She wasn't here to ask a question. She was here to make a point. Karoline straightened. "I'll say this one more time. If you have a relevant question, I will answer it, but I will not engage in bad faith arguments." The reporter chuckled softly. "Bad faith? Karoline, I'm doing my job. Isn't that what a free press is for?" Karoline didn't blink. A free press is about holding people accountable. What you're doing is turning this into a spectacle. Murmurs rippled through the room. The exchange was no longer about policy. It was something else now, something bigger. The reporter tapped her pen once. "So just to be clear, are you refusing to answer because you can't? Or because you don't want to?" A few reporters inhaled sharply, bracing for what came next. Karoline exhaled, steady and controlled. "I am refusing to play a game. This press conference is not about you." The smirk on the reporter's face flickered. Arms crossed. She leaned back. "Right, because expecting transparency is a game." More whispers, more glances exchange. Karoline adjusted the microphone, taking a step back from the podium. "I think we're done here." The shockwave was instant. The silence in the press room was no longer one of anticipation, it was suffocating. Karoline held her gaze steady, refusing to let a flicker of doubt show on her face. She knew this moment would become the center of media attention. That every movement, every word, could be twisted. The reporter raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" Karoline didn't flinch. "You've made it clear you're not interested in a real discussion. You're here for a headline." She let the words settle. "If you'd like to stay and listen to the rest of this press conference, you're welcome to, but I won't be answering any more of your questions." The reporter let out a quiet, mocking laugh. She shook her head. "So, silencing the press? Got it." Karoline's jaw tightened. She knew this was coming. She knew exactly how it would be spun the moment the cameras stopped rolling. But she also knew that with people like this, there was no winning. She cast a glance toward security, a small, almost imperceptible signal. And just like that, everything shifted. The air in the room snapped taut, like a rope being pulled to its breaking point. Cameras whirred and clicked. Journalists sat up straighter. Some exchanged glances, while others kept their heads down, pretending to take notes. The reporter noticed. Her smirk vanished. "You're seriously doing this?" Her voice was lower now, sharp enough to slice through the tension. Karoline didn't respond. A uniformed officer near the door took a deliberate step forward. He didn't need to say anything, the message was clear. The reporter had two choices: to escalate or double down. She chose the latter. "This is unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head. Then, louder, so the cameras would capture it. "So much for freedom of the press." "Huh?" Karoline remained composed. "Freedom of the press doesn't mean hijacking a press conference." A dry laugh. The reporter looked around the room as if expecting the other journalists to side with her. Some shifted uncomfortably. A few scribbled furiously. No one spoke. The officer took another step. For a fraction of a second, the reporter hesitated. She could stand her ground. Force them to physically remove her. That would be a viral moment. Or she could get up, walk out on her own terms, and control the narrative in another way. Karoline watched the decision play out behind the woman's eyes. Slowly, the reporter reached for her notepad. She stood, adjusted the strap of her bag. "This is a disgrace," she muttered, just loud enough for the microphones to pick up. Then, one final parting shot as she turned toward the exit. "You can kick me out, but you can't silence the truth." Karoline didn't respond. The door shut behind her. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, It should have been. The silence that followed was thick. Journalists exchanged uncertain looks. The cameras were still rolling. Some reporters kept their eyes down, pretending to take notes. Others just stared. Then, from the back of the room, a voice. Karoline, do you think this was the right decision? She turned toward the journalist who had spoken. I think it was necessary. Another voice. You don't think this will backfire? She knew it would. She knew that by the time she stepped off this podium, the internet would already be flooded with clips. She could already see the headlines. Karoline Leavitt removes reporter for asking tough questions. Freedom of the press under attack. Did it matter? She straightened her posture. We're here for discussions, not disruptions. If anyone has real questions, I'm happy to answer them. A beat of hesitation. Then, slowly, a hand went up. The press conference continued, but the real storm had just begun. Outside the press room, by the time Karoline stepped off the podium, her phone was already buzzing. Her aides hovered at the edge of the hallway, their faces tense as they glanced between their screens and the door the reporter had walked out of just minutes ago. One of them caught up with her, phone in hand. It's already trending. Hashtag silencing the press is picking up steam. Karoline exhaled through her nose. Of course it is. The aide hesitated. The major outlets are covering it. Some headlines are fair, just reporting what happened. But others, she trailed off, scrolling. Karoline stopped walking. Go on. The aide showed her the screen. Leavitt shuts down press freedom. Reporter escorted out for speaking truth to power. Karoline let out a half laugh, half scoff. Truth? She repeated. She wasn't speaking truth. She was performing. The aide nodded. Doesn't matter. That's not how it's being framed. Karoline had known this was coming the second she locked eyes with security. The way these moments played out was predictable now. Clip the tension, cut out the context, slap on a dramatic headline, and let the outrage machine do the rest. Still, as frustrating as it was, she wasn't about to panic. She had been in politics long enough to know that narratives could shift. What about our base? She asked, pushing open the door to her office. The aide followed her in. They're backing you. Conservative commentators are calling it a win, saying you handled it professionally. Karoline nodded. And the White House? They're distancing themselves, but they're not condemning you, yet. That last part hung in the air. Karoline leaned against her desk, arms crossed. And her? The aide didn't need to ask who she meant. She scrolled again, eyes flicking over her screen. She's already leaning into it. Did a live interview calling it? Karoline closed her eyes briefly, inhaling slowly. She already knew. This wasn't just a press conference anymore. It was a war for the narrative. And it had only just begun. The war of perception. Karoline stared at the ceiling for a brief second before pushing off her desk. She wanted this, she muttered, rubbing her temples. And we just gave it to her. Her aide bit her lip. So, what's the play here? Karoline didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the window, gazing down at the street below. Reporters had already gathered, their cameras angled toward the entrance, waiting for her next move. The noise outside was growing, the energy palpable. She had two options. She could stay silent and let the moment burn itself out. Let the headlines swirl for a day or two before another controversy took center stage. Or, she could get ahead of it before the narrative hardened. Before she became the villain in a story she hadn't written. Her jaw tightened. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Inside the war room, tension hummed like an exposed wire. Karoline stood with her hands on her desk, eyes fixed on the sea of headlines scrolling across her aides' screens. They're split, one of them said finally. Some are calling it justified, saying you handled an unprofessional disruption the way any press secretary should. But others, she hesitated. They're painting it as an attack on democracy. Karoline smirked, shaking her head. An attack on democracy, she repeated, voice laced with dry amusement. For removing a reporter who refused to follow the rules. The aide didn't respond. They both knew the truth didn't matter, not in the fast-moving world of digital outrage. Another aide stepped in, phone in hand. She just posted her full statement. Karoline inhaled deeply. Let's hear it. The aide read from the screen. Today, I was removed from a press conference for doing my job, asking tough questions. This administration claims to value transparency. But when faced with real scrutiny, they silence the press. This should alarm every American who believes in accountability and free speech." Karoline let out a short, humorless laugh. "And let me guess, no mention of how she disrupted the entire event?" The aide shook his head. "Nope, just playing the victim. Of course, it was all so predictable. The selective editing, the carefully framed outrage, the dramatic claims of suppression." Karoline had seen this game played before. And now, she had a choice. Her first instinct was to go on offense, to hold a press briefing. Lay out exactly what had happened. Remind the public that removing a disruptive journalist was not the same as silencing the press. But she knew how that would play out. Engaging meant feeding the outrage machine. It meant giving them more clips, more headlines, more fuel. She turned back to the window just in time to see a news van pull up. Another reporter stepped out, microphone in hand. The coverage wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was escalating. She tapped her fingers against the desk. "What's our strongest play?" The first aide hesitated. "We could release the full, unedited footage before her version gets too much traction. Let people see for themselves how many times you warned her before security stepped in." The second aide nodded. "That way, it doesn't look like a defensive move, just pure transparency." Karoline considered it. It was a smart move. Let the facts speak for themselves. But she also knew that in politics, facts didn't win battles. Perception did. Her eyes flicked to her phone, where notifications rolled in faster than she could read them. She could already predict the cable news segments, the outraged panel discussions, the op-eds dissecting her decision. A long breath in, a slow exhale. Then she nodded. "Release the full footage." Her aides moved quickly, drafting a statement, queuing up the video. Karoline watched them work, her mind already 10 steps ahead. The reporter had wanted a spectacle. What she didn't realize was that Karoline wasn't reacting. She was setting the stage for what came next. Within the hour, the video was live. No flashy edits, no dramatic commentary. Just a simple post. Watch for yourself. The full exchange between Karoline Leavitt and the reporter at today's press conference. The numbers ticked upward immediately. Thousands of views in minutes. Comments flooding in, some furious, some supportive. Her phone buzzed. A message from a close ally in the media. Smart move. This takes the wind out of their sails. But Karoline knew it wasn't that simple. The spin was already in motion. The reporter herself had gone on multiple networks, retelling the story in a way that cast herself as the victim. Karoline clicked on one of the interviews. There she was, seated in a dimly lit studio, brows furrowed in righteous indignation. "I was simply doing my job," she told the anchor. "I was asking tough but necessary questions. And instead of addressing them, I was removed. That should worry everyone, regardless of political affiliation." The anchor nodded solemnly. "Did you feel threatened?" Karoline rolled her eyes. "Threatened?" The reporter sighed. Her performance flawless. "Not physically. No," she said. Then, after a well-timed pause, "but professionally? Absolutely. This is an attack on journalism itself." The interview cut to a panel of experts, all weighing in on what this really meant. A dangerous precedent. A disturbing moment for free speech. She was just doing what journalists are supposed to do. Karoline exhaled sharply, locking her phone screen. The facts were out there. But that didn't mean people would accept them. An aide peeked into the office. "You're gonna want to see this." Karoline followed her into the hallway, where staff had gathered around a TV. Another breaking news banner flashed across the screen. And just like that, she knew. This wasn't over. The game of perception. The television screen flickered, tuned to a conservative network. The host leaned forward, his expression serious as he played the full clip, the same one Karoline had released. Pausing at key moments, he shook his head. "She interrupts over and over," he said, voice thick with disapproval. This wasn't journalism. This was grandstanding. The panelists nodded in agreement. This was a setup. One of them added, "She knew exactly what she was doing. Push until she gets removed. Then play the victim." The host turned back to the camera. "Here's the reality. Karoline Leavitt didn't shut down the press. She shut down an activist posing as a journalist." Karoline crossed her arms, watching as the conversation played out. The split was obvious. On one side, conservative voices praised her for standing her ground. On the other, mainstream outlets framed her as an authoritarian silencing the free press. Her aide glanced at her. This is gonna be a long week. Karoline nodded. Yeah, but at least now the truth is out there. The real question was, who would believe it? For days, the story refused to die. It dominated headlines, talk shows, social media debates. Political commentators dissected every second of the exchange, each side twisting the narrative to fit their agenda. Memes flooded the internet, some mocking the reporter, others portraying Karoline as the villain. But in the midst of the noise, something stood out. Karoline sat in her office, watching a clip from yet another panel discussion. Then, a familiar voice spoke, a veteran journalist. Not one of the partisans. Someone she actually respected. "We have to be honest," he said, leaning forward in his chair. This wasn't a journalist seeking the truth. This was someone looking for a viral moment. And they got it. The other panelists shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to hearing this kind of honesty. She asked a question, got an answer, didn't like it, and kept pushing, not for clarity, but for conflict. The moment she got removed, she ran straight to the cameras, claiming victimhood. That's not reporting, that's activism. The host frowned. So you're saying Karoline was justified? The journalist shrugged. I'm saying we need to be honest about what journalism is supposed to be. We're here to inform the public, not manufacture outrage. Karoline exhaled slowly. Finally, someone had said it, but she knew it didn't matter. The damage was done. The headlines had been written. The clips had been edited. The people who wanted to believe she was suppressing free speech weren't going to change their minds. And the people who supported her? They had already moved on, waiting for the next political fight. Her aide knocked softly on the door. Stepping inside. "You have an interview request from?" "No." The aide blinked. "You don't even know who it's from." "I don't care." Karoline stood up, brushing non-existent dust from her sleeve. "I'm not playing into this any further. The facts were out. Let them do what they wanted with them." The aide hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." Karoline grabbed her phone, scrolling through the endless notifications. The storm would pass. It always did. But she knew, this wasn't just about one press conference. It was about something bigger. The way the media operated now. The way narratives were crafted. The way truth had become secondary to clicks and outrage. She looked back at her aide. "Release one last statement. What do you want it to say?" Karoline thought for a moment. Then she smiled. "Just 4 words." The aide waited, pen poised. Karoline nodded. "Watch the full video. Because at the end of the day, that was all that mattered. The truth, whether people wanted to see it or not. In an era where clicks matter more than context, where the line between journalism and activism is blurrier than ever, media integrity is a fragile thing. The real question isn't whether Karoline was right or wrong. It's whether we, as a society, value truth enough to recognize when we're being manipulated. What do you think? Let's hear it in the comments below. And if you want more content like this, hit that subscribe button. Made with heart.